Welcome back to this last course on Shakespeare's romances. I'm going to focus on the Tempest today, and since I have analyzed the other texts in some detail today, I'm going to engage Shakespeare's critical tradition, and I'm going to enter into dialogue more with Shakespeare's criticism, and I'm going to choose as a focal point, as a focus of my discussion, Caliban. Now, it has become monotonously fashionable, I would say, to reduce the Tempest to, I quote, the first English example of fictional colonialist discourse, as Meredith and Skura wrote. The fashion started soon after the Second World War, I suppose, with Octave Manoni's book Psychologie de la colonisation, published in 1950, and translated into English as Prosper and Caliban, The Psychology of Colonization. As Harold Bloom writes, our archetypal politically correct article on Shakespeare these days is likely to be called Caliban and the Discourse of Colonialism, or else Ariel and the Economy of Exploitation, or even Prospero and Mercantilism. From such an ideological perspective, Prospero invariably becomes the hateful European colonist whose autocracy is established by the free use of fear, mystification, and torture. I quoted from Germaine Greer. Conversely, Caliban is cast in the role of the enslaved native, be he African, American, Asian, or even Irish, depending on the critic's political agenda. In Russ MacDonald's words, the colonialist reading in the past decades has demonized Prospero, sentimentalized Caliban, and tyrannized conferences and journals with a new orthodoxy, as one-sided as that which it had sought to replace. Harold Bloom notoriously dubbed new historicists, cultural materialists, post-colonialists, and all kinds of neo-Marxist critics the school of resentment in the Western canon. Such politically correct critics tend to turn Shakespeare's text into a mere pretext for whatever resentment, repentance, or remonstrance they want to bring to the fore. The island's many voices are silenced, and the Vulgate of contemporary cultural studies is recited in a perfunctory way. Indeed, ideological thinking is never really interested in diversity and difference, but aims to replace one orthodoxy with another, and for all its claims of rationality, it is often impermeable to arguments. Such thinking is not a disinterested quest for truth, but carries out an inflexible and often totalitarian agenda. It wants to affirm and conclude rather than to listen and question. As Graham Bradshaw notes, the failure to engage with Shakespeare's complex design produces partisan or authoritarian readings in which the conflicts these plays explore are treated as problems with a solution. Thus, the various materialist and historicist critics vilify Prospero and sentimentalize Caliban. In the cast of characters, of course, Caliban is called a savage and deformed slave. As Alden and Virginia Mason Vaughan note in their book on Caliban's Odyssey, the last decades of criticism have focused overwhelmingly on the monster's last attribute. Whereas earlier criticism was often interested in the concept of natural savage man, or in the link between physical and moral deformity, recent interpreters have discussed obsessively the final word, seeing Caliban as American or African or some other slave, either literally in bondage or bound by cultural chains of language and custom. Of course, this brave new orthodoxy does not go unchallenged. Critics have argued time and again that Caliban is not, I quote, Shakespeare's portrait of the proletariat, or his satirical comment on the rise of imperialism, the noble savage dispossessed by the ignoble white men, to quote Kenneth Muir. Similarly, Philip Edwards believed that Caliban is not in the play to stand for colonized Indians. He's natural man, instinctively poetic and instinctively brutal, longing for freedom and seeking it in the wrong quarter. I close the quotation. Burton Raffel points out that Prospero is neither a colonizer nor an imperialist. He does not choose to land on the island, but rather saves his and his young daughter's lives after they have been abandoned to die at sea by coming ashore anywhere he can, which is correct. The same position is formulated by David Scott Caston in 2000. Indeed, Prospero's status on the island is the same as Sycorax's, Caliban's mother. The former Duke of Milan and Caliban's dam both ended there as exiles. Despite Caliban's pretense that this island's mine by Sycorax, my mother, the little expanse of land placed 10 leagues beyond man's life does not belong to anyone in particular. As Brian Vickers so well put it, I quote, "Whether Sycorax as an exiled aggressor has more right to the island than Prospero as an injured victim is a moot point, but it is in any case not raised by the play. Prospero's stay on the island, then, is enforced, not voluntary, and while he can use its natural resources to stay alive, all the normal features of the hated colonist, murdering the natives, stealing their land, exporting their goods, produce and wealth for the profit back to one's home country, are conspicuously lacking," Vickers writes. If modern critics want to denounce colonialism, they should do so by all means, but this is the wrong play, Vickers concludes. No one can deny that Prospero does enslave Caliban and does treat him cruelly when the play opens. But actually this only happens after the monster he had adopted and nurtured had attempted to rape Miranda. This is no trivial crime and cannot be explained away in the ideological terms of Prospero's concerns with the racial purity of his bloodline. In Kim Hall's Twisted Understanding, Prospero's concern about his young daughter's integrity becomes, I quote, his obsessive attempts to control his environment and his daughter's sexuality. Come on. And Caliban's attempted rape is read as the misgenerative threat or the threat against an aristocratic body. Absolute nonsense. Fortunately, myriad-minded Shakespeare is elastic enough to resist these stretches of over-interpretation. His great artistic force frustrates such reductive readings through ambiguity and irony, which stimulate interpretation, resist deconstruction, escape simplifications, and mock all attempts of ideological enlistment. Shakespeare is never simple or simplistic, and his characters are never one-sided. The tyrant Titus Andronicus unflinchingly slays his own kin, yet he cares for a fly. And ruthless Shylock, for example, utters the most heartbreaking soliloquy about human suffering. Similarly, the savage and deformed slave Caliban speaks some of the most poetic passages in Shakespeare's complete works, and proves able to seek for grace at the end of the play. Learning to curse goes hand in hand with learning to sing, and crime is never too far removed from grace. As Northrop Frye noted, ill-treated and despised Caliban is never denied his dignity, even when everybody in the play calls him a thing most foul, filth, fish, tortoise, monster, or slave. And yet, the born slave defies Prospero's authority, only to voluntarily get a new master in the unlikely person of clown Stefano. Perhaps Caliban is a born slave after all. Caliban is fascinating precisely because of his ambiguous character. Vicious, yet honest. Lusty, yet childish. Unruly, yet slavish. Daring, yet cowardly. Foul-minded, yet poetical. A born devil, a fish, and yet a man. In all respects, he is the most complex character of the play, and perhaps the focal point of the entire dramatic and philosophical construction of the Tempest. Like the island, which seems barren to the men of sin but fertile to idealists like Gonzalo, Caliban is actually what you will. He cannot be reduced to only one meaning, but takes meaning from each character in the play and gives new meaning to each living soul on the island. To begin with, Caliban is the opposite of Ariel, the delicate spirit of freedom and poetry whose only desire is to ascend unrestrained to the higher elements, as Lucrezia shows. Ariel, as his veterotestamentary angelic name suggests, is flight and flame, floating about like the Holy Ghost in the early days of creation, animating the island and flaming amazement. While Ariel stands for the nobler elements, Caliban represents the lower ones. Indeed, he is called Earth by Prospero, and is often compared to water animals, fish, tortoise, by other people on the island. Earth, of course, signifies perishable animal aspects of human nature, since both Adam in Hebrew and Homo humanus humus in Latin are etymologically related to earth, as Julia Reinhardt Lupton points out. Along the known Platonic lines, Ariel may symbolize spirit and Caliban body, the two steeds led by the charioteer from Plato's Phaedrus. In the same allegorical type of reading, Ariel represents poetic genius and Caliban stands for raw poetic material. The agent of Prospero's potent magic and the resilient earth also symbolize art and nature. Caliban also embodies animal nature, while Ariel suggests the angelic potential of man. The two extremes described by Pico della Mirandola in his celebrated oration on the dignity of man. In a Jungian reading, Caliban and Ariel may be projections of man's psyche, id or umbra versus ego or superego, but even such a large array of meanings is too reductive for Shakespeare, who often employs what William Empson called the seventh type of ambiguity, by which something and its contrary are meant at the same time. Caliban may be water and earth, raw matter, a body fully body, a born devil on whose nature nurture can never stick, but at the same time his spirit is eager for liberty, like Ariel's. The problem is not, as some critics believe, that Caliban was enslaved by Prospero. It consists, I think, in Caliban's fundamental inability to distinguish between true freedom and different degrees of servitude. Caliban does not choose freedom over slavery by choosing Stefano over Prospero, obviously, but rather decides to serve a drunken clown and thus matter over an enlightened lord who had taught him language, and thus spirit. Ban, ban, Caliban has a new master, get a new man, the drunk master sings, before shouting, freedom, high day. And yet, at the end of the terrible day of reckoning, when no man was his own, he realizes his foolishness and is apparently ready to abandon his slavish inclination. Let us also note in passing that both Ariel and Caliban desire freedom from Prospero's control to the point of becoming ungrateful, malignant things. However, Ariel has every reason to be indebted to Prospero, who freed him from the cloven pine into which he had been confined by Sycorax. Whereas, on the other hand, Caliban does not owe his initial freedom and happiness to Prospero. In his revolt against the magician's tyranny, Caliban actually has more grounds than Ariel. Critics have also noted that Caliban is often as full of poetry as the delicate spirit filling the isle with noises. Shakespeare wants the audience to understand this, and therefore gives the monster exceedingly beautiful poetry. Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that if I then had waked after long sleep will make me sleep again. And then in dreaming the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked I cried to dream again. From this perspective, Ariel and Caliban may embody different types of poetic inspiration and expression, different styles of sense and sensibility. Caliban is not only the opposite of Ariel, he also works as a male and monstrous double of Miranda. When Prospero arrived on the island, he found there Sycorax's cub, gabbling like a thing most brutish, not knowing its own meaning. Prospero did not kill the little monster, did not ship him to Tunis, and certainly did not begin by enslaving or imprisoning him, as post-colonialist critics too easily forget. Instead, Prospero adopted Caliban, sheltered him in his cave, and brought him up alongside with his only daughter. Abhorred Caliban and admired Miranda, the repulsive monster and the paragon of feminine beauty and purity, were actually educated together as brothers. Prospero and his daughter taught Caliban language. In the famous words attributed to Miranda in the first folio, but more adequate for Prospero, as Dryden and I myself believe, Caliban is scolded for his ingratitude. Abhorred slave, which any print of goodness will not take, being capable of all ill. I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or other, when thou didst not, savage, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gabble like a thing most brutish, I endowed thy purposes with words that made them known. But thy vile race, though thou didst learn, had that in it which good natures could not abide to be with. Therefore wast thou deservedly confined into this rock, who hadst deserved more than a prison. Caliban's answer is horridly ungrateful. You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language. Now, ideologists like to stress that Prospero and Miranda taught Caliban their language, as if they could teach him articulate speech without using the one particular language they knew. This is, of course, tendentious overinterpretation. Caliban is not taught the colonist's language instead of his native one, for the simple reason that he did not have a native language. He is taught language tout court, and thus gains access to reason and is liable to know his own meaning. At the Ciceronian junction between ratio and oratio, as Vickers noted, Caliban becomes human. In this light, Stephen Greenblatt's idea that the Tempest heightens, I quote, the startling encounter between a lettered and an unlettered culture, is wrong. For Caliban is a speechless whelp rather than the representative of an oral culture when Prospero finds him on the island. Through the gift of language, the monster is turned into a man, able to name the bigger light and the less. One may wish to think of Renaissance texts in which articulate man is opposed to dumb animals, as in Gelli's Circe, for example. Like the witch Circe, Sycorax, whose name suggests the crossbreed of swine and crow, turns humanity into animal stupidity and virtue into appetite. Sycorax's Caliban is a mere animal. Prospero's Caliban becomes a man. If one is anxious to conclude, one may say that the failed rapist Caliban is the exact opposite of the chaste maiden Miranda. And just as earth and tortoise Caliban is the radical antithesis of fiery and airy Ariel. But here again, Shakespeare is more ambitious than ordinary writers and allows Caliban to become an ironical commentary on Miranda as well. To Miranda, the crowd of usurpers, conjurers, doting fools and drunken servants assembled before Prospero's cell are a brave new world. "'Tis new to thee," Prospero comments in the driest, most monosyllabically anticlimactic Shakespearean hemistich. "'Tis new to thee." And he's right, of course. The world Miranda admires is neither new nor brave. It is the wicked old world that banished her and Prospero, conspired against royalty yet again, and will forever be just as vile as treacherous. One cannot tell if, in her rapture with the beauteous mankind of the brave new world, Miranda heard her father's bitter comment. In all likelihood, her naivety remains intact. Caliban, on the other hand, is quicker to realize how foolish he was to take the clown Stephano for a god and his brandy for celestial liquor. Miranda is denied that moment of anagnorisis, and thus Caliban is allowed to outsmart her. Next to Prospero, he's actually the only character to reach this enchanted understanding of human nature and implicitly of the tragic essence of history. Caliban also stands in ironic contrast to Ferdinand then. When Miranda meets the young prince, "the third man that ever I saw," as she says, she takes him for a divine spirit. Prospero's disillusioned comment does not tarry. "To the most of men this is a Caliban, and they to him are angels," the old magician warns the foolish wench, to quote from the text. Prospero may just want to temper Miranda's enthusiasm, but he may also be right. We know too well that there is only a thin line between imagination and reality where love is involved. One may remember the tricks of love in A Midsummer Night's Dream, when frantic lovers saw Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt, and the fairy queen was enamored of an ass. Such tricks has strong imagination. Caliban, of course, is an underdog, and materialist critics have no difficulty placing him in the same rank as the working-class servant, so to say, Stephano and Trinculo. But Caliban is not a clown, and certainly not a fool. His dignity far exceeds that of the two men, animated only by their divine liquor. By insulting Caliban, the two fools think they can assert their superior humanity, but actually their jokes fire back. It is not Caliban they mock, but themselves. Only, unlike Caliban, they don't even realize what fools they are. I'm quoting from Caliban. "I'll be wise hereafter and seek for grace. What a thrice double ass was I to take this drunkard for a god and worship this dull fool." True to the function suggested by etymology, the monster demonstrates that being a normally shaped human being, like Stephano, does not guarantee the nobility that Renaissance philosophers commonly associate with human nature. Whereas Stephano and Trinculo remain caricatures, the monster Caliban becomes a representative of common humanity, as Yves Bonnefoy remarked. "This thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine," Prospero says almost fondly. But irony can also be heard in these words. Grace has improved brute nature, but it failed to convert human nature. Like Prospero, we have to acknowledge that Caliban is somehow ours, Harold Bloom notes. The wisdom and humility Caliban derives from his anagnorisis in the last act of the Tempest also humbled the treacherous brothers, Antonio and Sebastian. Whereas the monster is able to be wise hereafter and seek for grace, or at least says so, the men of sin are impenitent like Iago. I disagree with Iono Mesco, who thinks that Caliban is untouched by grace. The born devil transforms his explosive mixture of slavishness and murderous resentment into genuine humility, and as a result receives dominion of the island. His understanding rather than his revolt have restored his freedom. Through wisdom and humility, Caliban finally attains human dignity. The monster, the fish, the born devil is more humane, more prone to grace, less wolvish than the Hobbesian princes, and therefore becomes Shakespeare's disenchanted and ironic comment on society and politics in general. And yet Prospero returns to civilization with the conjurers, instead of turning the isle into a paradise of justice and prosperity where a perfect society can arise. Caliban remains on the island. Ariel joins the elements. The spirits dissolve into thin air. Even on an island controlled by a mighty magician, fairyland can last no longer than utopia, and can certainly not be shipped back to Milan or Naples. In this respect, Caliban is Shakespeare's conservative, unsentimental and ironic comment on utopian dreams and on the myth of the noble savage. There is no such thing as a noble savage in The Tempest, just as there is no such thing as a perfect society. Montaigne's essay De Cannibales on cannibals, quoted almost verbatim by dear old Gonzalo, is deconstructed word by Caliban, who thus becomes Shakespeare's answer to the French philosopher as well. Whether Montaigne really believed in the innate goodness of human nature unspoiled by civilization, like Rousseau, and as his followers also did, is a matter of dispute. Shakespeare certainly did not. As elsewhere, he exposes and ridicules the generous utopian dreams fostered by wholly honorable men. Gonzalo, for example, is the only decent courtier on the island, and yet the vision he derived from Montaigne is ridiculous, as the two villainous brothers instantly realizes. The latter end of his commonwealth forgets the beginning. The men of sin correctly note, when Gonzalo says that he would admit no sovereignty on the island he intended to rule as a king. The communist dream of forbidding property, marriage and social hierarchies is ridiculous, as Caliban shows. Natural man craves for the rulership of the island, and his drives are conducive to rape rather than to love, as Caliban illustrates. Honorable, doting Gonzalo fails to understand the lesson of realpolitik that Caliban illustrates, but the two men of sin know it all too well. Men's natural instincts are to kill and harm, to serve or to enslave others, not to live freely and happily together, innocent and pure as Gonzalo wanted. And yet, in this universal slaughterhouse, even born devils can experience beauty, harmony, and grace. Caliban is also an ironic answer to Prospero, the magician who hopes to improve nature by enforcing art. The nature Renaissance magicians wanted to improve was not limited to the elements, but included human nature. A sound magician is a mighty god, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus believed. Although he is able to control delicate spirits like Ariel and vile natures like Caliban, to rend trees and to stir tempests, Prospero fails miserably to improve human nature. Caliban is a constant reminder of Prospero's failure to civilize the brute beast. And yet, the beast is civilized through the ineffable action of grace and understanding. Caliban actually had it in himself to become wise, just as he had music in himself, which means harmony, of course, and grace. Nurture and nature, art and reality, spirit and matter collide in Caliban. But the beauty of his final conversion to goodness is not Prospero's merit. The old man was unable to improve Caliban through education or magic, just as he failed to convert the treacherous courtiers through his magnanimous forgiveness. If one wants to read between the lines an autobiographical reflection on the power of drama, one is free to do so. And Prospero's farewell to his art becomes Shakespeare's farewell to theatre, the adieu uttered by a disenchanted artist who realizes that fiction cannot improve reality and art cannot improve human nature. Caliban shames nature and art, but proves the miracle of grace, which is beyond human nature or human art. Left alone on the island at the end of the play, Caliban silently expresses the same ironical comment on man that Puck utters at the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Puck's "good night unto you all" alludes to the darkness enveloping reason and passion alike when art cannot effect the necessary understanding. And yet, at the end of the play, the repentant thing of darkness also sends a beacon of light to the happy few who can perceive it. Finally, I would suggest that Shakespeare also holds an ironic mirror up to his posthumous critics through Caliban. In the same way as he pointed out the faults of the men on the island, Caliban reveals the piteous deficiencies of ideological criticism obsessed with preaching, labeling, and concluding. In his ambiguous and ironic way, Caliban shows that nothing can be shown, that human nature cannot be reduced to a social formula. Shakespeare's supreme irony is perpetually at work. The way Caliban is interpreted tells us more about the interpreter than about the monster who is interpreted. Critics who reduce Caliban to the lame ideological cliché of the native oppressed in a colonial world fail to understand the concomitant dignity and objection of the monster's character, his irreducible complexity, and his ambiguity. In the encounter between the monster and those critics eager to vent their righteous indignation, as Brian Vickers put it, the monster shames the critics. In the confrontation between ideology and irony, irony invariably carries the day.